Hi everyone. We are going to talk about how to properly frame quotations. When you are writing an academic essay, you're often asked to insert quotes from scholarly sources that support your ideas. But there's a proper way to do this. Well, some writers assume that quotes will just speak for themselves. Because the meaning of the quotation is obvious to them, they think readers will clearly see what they mean if they just insert a quotation into the text. But instead, we need to think of quotes as orphans. They're words that have been taken from their original context and need to be integrated into their new textual surroundings. Let's look at this quote here. This quote is the entire paragraph. There are no words from the writer explaining why it's there. The author does go on to comment afterward about the quote, but that doesn't help us understand why the quote's here in the first place. Let's look at the information. It's about dieting. It says, until television was introduced in Fiji in 1995, 3 years after programs from the US and Britain began broadcasting there, 62% of the girls surveyed reported dieting. So that's interesting information, but we're not quite filled in on what the point is that the reader's trying to make. Let's look at the same quote in a minute that is properly framed with this format. So here's the framework we want to use whenever we are using a quote in our writing. Number 1, we want to introduce the quote. 2 is state the quote. And 3 is explain how the quote relates to the point you're trying to make. It always needs to be connected to what you are trying to say. If you look at the same quote from Susan Bordeaux here, framed by what the writer's point is, it makes a lot more sense. She starts out with an introduction of the idea of the quote by saying, the feminist philosopher Susan Bordeaux deplores Western media's obsession with female thinness and dieting. Her basic complaint is that increasing numbers of women across the globe are being led to see themselves as fat and in need of a diet. Citing the islands of Fiji as a case in point, Bordeaux notes that, and she quotes that same quote again. So you see how she clearly introduced the topic that she is presenting here. After the quote, she goes on to explain the point that she's trying to make and how it relates. She says Bordeaux's point is that the Western cult of dieting is spreading even to remote places. Ultimately, Bordeaux complains the culture of dieting will find you regardless of where you live. So she integrates that quote smoothly into her text and then explains how the quote relates to what she has to say. This is the correct way of framing a quotation. We're going to skip this, and I want to show you 3 ways that you can integrate your quote smoothly into your writing. The first is to create a clause using the word that. So you can see the writer starts out, Johnson argues against this common claim, writing that whenever we torture or mistreat prisoners, we are in the wrong. So that word that integrates the rest of the quotation smoothly within the writer's words and makes it a sentence that flows well. The second way to introduce a quotation is with a colon. So the Walt Whitman, the great poet, sang its praises, colon. It's our game, the American game. This is another good way to introduce a quote. Thirdly, you can weave quoted words or phrases into your own sentence. So again, this is similar to this one without using the word that. The idea that childhood rebellion is proper, quote, separates the 2 authors. So this writer seamlessly integrated the quote into his or her own words. Now let's look at block quotations. A block quotation happens when you have a quotation that is 4 lines or longer. When this happens, you do not integrate it in the same way into your sentences. You indent here and include the quote. So it's still framed. Here we have the introduction. Here we have the quotation. Below it, we have the explanation of it. But we have it indented over because it is a longer quotation. And I do want to point out that this example is incorrect in the point that it has quotation marks here. When a quote is in a block quote like this, there are no quotation marks. The actual indentation itself represents quotation marks. So we want to make sure that we do not have quotation marks in that example. So finally, the biggest point about framing your quotations is that this is for the reason of making your voice heard. Using quotes is a way to support your ideas, to back up what you have to say by providing evidence. So you would never want quotes to overtake your writing. When you write, you want your voice to be heard, your ideas to stand out, and you want readers to understand your unique perspective about the issue at hand. So never let quoted material drown out your voice. Just let it support your voice. I hope this helps you frame quotations in your writing, and please ask me if you have any questions.